She was promised to a man she feared. She ran to the only man she'd ever loved, and by morning nothing would ever be the same. Before the border. The carriage, February 14th, 1814, 2:17 a.m., North Road, outskirts of London, 3 hours from the Scottish border. The rain did not fall, it attacked. It came sideways in sheets, hammering the wooden walls of the carriage with a violence that made the whole frame shudder, as though even the sky had an opinion about what they were doing tonight. The lanterns on either side of the door swayed with each gust, throwing amber light that flickered and vanished, and came back again, casting the interior in a rhythm of shadow and gold. Inside, the world was very small, and very quiet. Lady Cecily Vane sat with her back straight against the cushioned seat, her travelling cloak still damp at the shoulders, her small leather bag pressed against her side, as though it might escape if she let go. Her hair, which her maid had spent 40 minutes arranging that evening for the dinner she had never attended, was half undone now. One curl pressed against her cheek. She didn't move it. Across from her, James Ashbourne, the Duke of Ravenwood, looked out the window. He had not looked at her in 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted. He sat the way he always sat, spine straight, one arm resting along the window ledge, the other hand still on his knee. His coat was deep charcoal, shoulders broad and unhurried, and despite the hour, despite everything, he gave the impression of a man entirely in possession of himself. The only evidence of tension was the slight tightening of his jaw when the carriage hit a rough patch of road. A muscle just below the ear that appeared and disappeared. Cecily had memorized that muscle months ago. He's thinking, she told herself. He does this. He goes somewhere inside himself and thinks, and you just have to wait. She was not good at waiting. Outside, the North Road stretched invisible through the darkness and the storm, and somewhere miles behind them, her father's house stood with its lights blazing. She had seen them as the carriage pulled away, every window burning, and she had not looked back after that. She had fixed her eyes on the inside of the carriage door and pressed her lips together and simply breathed. She breathed now, in. The smell of rain and the cold that had crept through the frame. Old leather, and underneath it all, faint, familiar, devastating. The scent of him, wool and winter air, and something she had never been able to name. Something that meant safe in a language her body had learned without her permission. The carriage lurched, a wheel caught in a rut in the flooded road, and the whole body of it pitched sharply sideways. Cecily's bag flew from her grip. Her hand shot out for something to hold and found nothing. She slid across the seat entirely and collided with something solid and warm. His arm closed around her before she could process what was happening. 1 second, she was falling. The next, she was held. His hand was at her shoulder, steadying her, and she was pressed against the side of him, his chest against her arm, her face turned toward his throat, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved. She felt him breathe. A slow, careful breath, deliberate and controlled, the kind a man takes when he is deciding something. The carriage righted itself. The road smoothed. He did not let go immediately. 1 second, 2. Then his hand withdrew from her shoulder, slowly, not abruptly, and he shifted back to his side of the seat. When she pulled herself upright and turned to look at him, he was already looking at the window again. But the muscle below his ear was working. "Sorry," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't be." 2 words. Quiet. She retrieved her bag from the floor, settled it back against her hip, looked at the opposite window, rain streaking down the glass in long, uneven lines, the world beyond it entirely black. The silence resumed. It was not an unkind silence. That was what she had come to understand about him, over months of learning the particular grammar of who he was. Some silences were dismissal. Some were indifference. His were neither. His silences were the way a room holds its breath before someone finally says the thing that matters. She had been waiting for him to say the thing that mattered since the moment she'd climbed into this carriage. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. She almost laughed. That was not it. "Yes." "There's a blanket behind you." She didn't turn for it. "James." He looked at her then. Finally. Fully. In the flickering lantern light, his eyes were the color of deep water, grey at the edges, darker at the center, and they held on her with a steadiness that she had once found unnerving and now found to be the only thing capable of making her feel still. "Ask me," he said. Very quiet. She had been going to ask if he was certain, if he understood what this would cost him. If somewhere between her father's threats and the 3-day silence, and the one-line note in the back of a borrowed book, he had stopped to consider that when morning came, his reputation would survive this, and hers would not. That the world would call her ruined, that the world would say she had chased him. She had been going to ask all of that. Instead, she heard herself say, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" The lantern swayed. James Ashbourne looked at her across the small, impossible distance of a carriage in a storm, 3 hours from the Scottish border, at 2 in the morning on the 14th of February. And something in his expression shifted. Not softened. Something more than that. Something like a man removing a coat he had worn so long he had forgotten it wasn't his skin. He opened his mouth to answer, and the chapter broke. 6 months earlier. August 1813, Harrington House, Mayfair, London. The first night of the season. The ballroom was too bright, too loud, and smelled of hothouse roses and the particular desperation of mothers with unmarried daughters. Cecily stood near the third pillar from the left. She had counted in the first 10 minutes because counting was something to do. With a glass of lemonade she didn't want, and a smile she had been wearing for so long, it had stopped feeling like a smile and started feeling like a fixture of her face. She was 19 years old, and she had been introduced to 32 people in the last hour. She knew this because she had also counted that. Lord this, Lady that. And of course you've met... No, she had not. She had met no one who asked her a single question that was not about her father's estate, or the likelihood of her accepting a second season invitation. She had smiled at all of them. She would continue to smile. She was very good at smiling in ways that gave nothing away. Across the room, her father stood with a cluster of gentlemen, laughing at something with the wide-open laugh he only used in public. She watched him for a moment. 3 weeks ago she had found the letters in his study by accident. She had been looking for a book, and the drawer had been open and the numbers had been there, staring up at her, impossible to unread. Debts, significant ones. The kind that explained why he had been watching her since the start of the season, with a particular measuring attention. She looked away from him. She was looking at nothing in particular, just letting her eyes travel the room without landing anywhere, when she noticed the man across the ballroom. He was standing near the windows, not near the conversation, not near the dancing. He stood slightly apart from a group of gentlemen, one shoulder turned fractionally toward the glass, as though part of him was already somewhere else, and he was watching the room with the expression of someone performing an obligation he had decided long ago to simply endure. She recognized that expression. She was wearing it. He was tall, broad at the shoulder, lean at the jaw, with dark hair that was slightly too long to be fashionable, and a coat that was exceptionally well made and completely uncelebrated, the kind of clothes a man wears when he has nothing to prove. There was a stillness to him that was different from the stillness of boredom. It was more deliberate than that, more contained. She didn't know who he was. She was still looking, not staring, she told herself, observing, when he turned his head. And looked directly at her. Not a glance. Not the sliding, assessing look that most men in this room had given her tonight. He simply looked. Directly. Unhurriedly. As though he had been aware of her looking and had decided without ceremony to look back. Cecily felt the heat rise from her collarbone to her cheekbones in approximately 1 second. She turned her attention to her lemonade. Composed, she told herself. You are composed. She counted to 7. When she looked up again, he was no longer by the window. She scanned the room, and then she heard him. Not his voice. His presence, slightly behind her and to the left, moving past her toward the corridor. The draft of cold air from outside that clung to his coat as he passed, and then at the exact moment he was beside her, not stopping, not turning, she heard, very low, "You look as thoroughly bored as I feel." He was gone before she could turn her head. She stood very still with her lemonade and her third pillar, and her heart beating in a way that had nothing to do with the crowded room, or the hothouse roses, or the weight of her father's debts. She looked at the corridor he had disappeared into. She looked back at the ballroom. Later, in the carriage home, she asked her brother, who had been standing near the windows for the first hour. He looked at her strangely. "That was Ravenwood," he said. "The Duke of Ravenwood, 32 years old. Fought at Salamanca and Vitoria. Inherited the title after his uncle died in 1811. His wife passed the year after that." A pause. "Why?" "No reason," Cecily said. She looked out the carriage window at the dark London streets slipping past. and thought, with a certainty she could not have explained, "I'm going to see him again." September 3rd, 1813, 3:41 p.m. Pemberton House, Kensington. Private garden. The tea had been going on for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Cecily knew this because the clock in the Pemberton drawing room had a particularly loud tick, and she had been listening to it since the moment she sat down between Mrs. Alcott, who wanted to discuss the misfortune of her eldest son's recent engagement to a girl from Derbyshire, and Lady Pembridge, who wanted to discuss the misfortune of everything else. She had nodded in the correct places. She had made the correct sounds. She had held her teacup with both hands and kept her back straight and smiled at the correct intervals. And somewhere around the 1 hour and 50-minute mark, she had become aware of a very quiet and very insistent thought forming at the base of her skull. "If I do not get air in the next 5 minutes, I am going to say something unforgivable." She excused herself with the sort of soft, apologetic murmur that required no explanation, just a breath of air. The room is so warm, and slipped through the glass doors at the far end of the drawing room before anyone could follow. The garden received her like a relief. It was a proper English garden in early September, still green but beginning to turn at the edges, the roses past their peak and moving into something quieter and more honest, the hedgerows trimmed into geometry along the far wall. The afternoon light came low and golden through the sycamore at the garden's corner, throwing long shadows across the gravel path. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of late-season lavender, and underneath it, the very first suggestion of autumn. Cecily exhaled. She walked the length of the path slowly, her fingers trailing along the top of the low hedge, letting the sound of the drawing room bleed away behind her. The distant tick of the clock, the layered voices, her father's face at breakfast that morning. Watching her with that particular quiet calculation she had been seeing more and more often since the start of the season. She stopped at the stone bench near the sycamore and simply stood beside it, face tipped slightly upward, looking at the sky through the leaves. She heard the garden door open behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. Whoever it was would either speak, or they would take another path and leave her to her silence, and either way she would manage. She waited. Footsteps on gravel, measured, unhurried. Then, nothing. She turned. He was lowering himself onto the bench at the opposite end of the path, perhaps 10 feet from where she stood, unhurried and completely self-possessed, as though sitting in a garden at a women's tea was the most natural thing in the world. He had a book in his hand. He opened it. He did not look at her. Cecily stared at him for a full 3 seconds. The Duke of Ravenwood. In daylight he was different. She had only ever seen him at night in ballrooms, with candlelight and shadow doing their usual work of making everyone either more or less than they were. In the low September sun he was simply himself, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as his eyes moved down the page, a thin, pale scar beginning just below the left side of his jaw. She hadn't noticed it before. She noticed it now. He turned a page. He's not going to acknowledge me, she realized. He was simply here, occupying the same garden with the same equanimity he seemed to bring to every room he entered, requiring nothing from the situation, adding no social performance to it. Something about that made her shoulders drop. She sat, not next to him. There were several feet of bench between them, but she sat, and she turned her face back toward the sky, and for a while they existed in the same silence without it being uncomfortable. The leaves moved. A bird called from somewhere in the sycamore. The distant sound of women's voices inside the house rose and fell like weather. After a while, she couldn't help it. "What are you reading?" He turned the book toward her without looking up, holding it at an angle so she could see the cover, the collected letters of Lord Byron. She blinked. "You read poetry?" Now he looked up, just briefly. There was something at the corner of his mouth, not quite amusement, but the territory adjacent to it. "Is that surprising?" "Frankly," she said before she could stop herself, "yes." This time the corner of his mouth actually moved. It was small, the most restrained version of a smile she had ever seen. But it was there, and it lasted approximately 2 seconds before it was gone, and in those 2 seconds, Cecily had the disorienting sensation of watching a house with all its curtains drawn suddenly let light through a single window. She looked at her hands in her lap. "My brother told me who you are," she said, because apparently she had decided to do this. After the Harrington ball. Did he? Not a question. A quiet acknowledgement. He said you fought at Salamanca. A pause. He turned another page. Among other places. He said your wife passed 2 years ago. The page stopped turning. She felt it immediately. The shift. Not coldness exactly. Something more like a door that had been fractionally open returning to its frame. She saw his hand on the book, fingers resting still against the spine, and she thought, "You went too far, Cecily. You always go too far." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. That was intrusive. Another pause. Longer. Then, unexpectedly, she was kind. His voice had changed texture. It was still low, still even, but something in it had become unguarded in a way that felt entirely involuntary, as though the words had gotten out before he could decide about them. He was looking at the book, but she didn't think he was reading it. She deserved better than a husband who was at war for 3 of their 4 years of marriage. Cecily didn't say anything. She understood instinctively that this was not the moment for words. She simply sat with what he'd said and let it be what it was. A blackbird moved through the hedge to her left, rustling and gone. After a moment, James Ashbourne looked up from the book and looked at her directly, and it was the same look from the Harrington ballroom, the one that didn't slide or assess, the one that simply landed. In daylight, it was more than she'd bargained for. His eyes were a grey that shifted toward green at the edges, and they were, she thought, profoundly tired. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept. The tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had simply grown used to the weight of it. "Your name is Cecily," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew. "Yes." "What are you doing at this tea, Lady Cecily?" "My mother was invited and is unwell, so I came in her place." "That's why you're here," he said. "What are you doing in this garden?" She understood the distinction. She looked at the lavender border along the far wall and considered being evasive and decided against it. "Surviving," she said. The not-quite smile returned. Slightly wider this time, still restrained. Still devastating, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying very hard not to be. "Yes," he said, "I know that feeling." They stayed in the garden for another half hour. They talked about Byron, and whether his reputation was separable from his work. She thought not. He thought the work made its own argument regardless of the man. They talked about London in September versus London in February, and which was more bearable, and agreed without much discussion that February was an offence against the spirit. She asked carefully what Salamanca had been like, and he was quiet for a moment and then said simply, "Loud," and she had the sense that this was not evasion, but the most honest compression of something too large to fit into a garden conversation. He did not ask about her father or her prospects, or whether she intended a second season. He asked what she was reading, and whether she preferred the city or the country. And at one point he asked, with the same directness he seemed to bring to everything, "Are you happy?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the late gold light moving across the gravel. "I'm working on it," she said finally. He nodded once as though this was a satisfactory answer, as though working on it was the only honest thing a person could say, and he respected her for saying it. "When Mrs. Alcott's voice called from the glass doors. "Lady Cecily, we're serving the second course." Cecily stood and smoothed her dress and looked down at him, still seated, still holding his Byron. "It was good to speak with you, Your Grace," she said, "because etiquette required something." He looked up. "James," he said. She stilled. "My name is James." Simply, as though the correction were obvious. She stood with the afternoon light on her face, and the lavender smell in the air and the sound of Mrs. Alcott growing impatient at the door, and she thought, "No one has ever given me their name like that, like a thing offered freely, with no expectation of anything in return." "James," she said. It fit strangely in her mouth, too familiar, too real. He held her gaze for one more moment, that steady, unhurried hold, and then he looked back down at his book. She walked back to the house. At the glass door, hand on the frame, she paused, looked back. He hadn't moved, still on the bench, still with the Byron. But the book was lowered, just slightly, and his eyes were on the middle distance, unfocused, somewhere else entirely. Thinking, she knew. She turned and went inside. She did not stop thinking about the way he'd said her name for the rest of the afternoon, or that evening, or the morning after. October, November, 1813. London, the Literary Society of Mayfair, Cavendish Hall. It started with a book, or rather, it started with a note inside a book, which is a different thing entirely. The Literary Society of Mayfair occupied the ground floor of a narrow townhouse on Brook Street, and its library, which smelled magnificently of old paper and cedar and the particular dusty dignity of books that had been handled by many careful hands, was open to its members on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons between 2 and 5 o'clock. Cecily had been a member since she was 17. Her father had arranged it as an afterthought, something respectable to fill her afternoons. She had gone every Thursday since without fail, which meant she knew the library the way you know a room you have loved in private. The loose board near the third shelf, the window seat that caught afternoon light from 2:30 to 4:15, the particular shelf in the back where the newer acquisitions were kept before they were catalogued. She had not known until the first Thursday of October that James Ashbourne was also a member. She discovered it in the simplest possible way. She pulled a newly published novel from the acquisitions shelf, still stiff at the spine, the ink scarcely settled into the paper, opened to the first page, and found a small folded paper tucked inside the front cover. She looked at it for a moment, unfolded it. The handwriting was precise and unhurried. The letters formed with the economy of a man who had written many dispatches under difficult conditions and had learned that clarity was its own elegance. I read this last spring. Page 84. She says something that is either deeply true or deeply irritating, and I cannot decide which. I'd be curious what you think. No signature. She didn't need one. She stood at the back shelf of the Mayfair Literary Society library, with the note in her hand, and felt something move through her chest, warm and swift and slightly frightening, like the first morning of a new season, when you step outside and realize the temperature has changed overnight and there is no going back to what it was before. She turned to page 84. He had underlined in pencil a single line. She had been forced into prudence in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequence of an unnatural beginning. Cecily read it twice. Then she took out her own pencil, the small one she kept in her bag, and beneath his underline she wrote in her own hand, "It is true, which is why it is irritating." She folded the note back inside the cover, returned the book to the shelf, walked to the window seat and sat down with a different book entirely, and opened it, and read precisely none of it. The following Thursday the novel had been replaced. In its spot was a different book, The Odyssey, which had not been on the acquisitions shelf before, with a new note inside the front cover. Fair point, though I'd argue the irritating ones are usually the truest ones. Also, I see you took the window seat. I had planned on the window seat. She smiled at the note for longer than was sensible. She wrote back, "You were not here to claim it. Possession is 9/10." She left him The Odyssey with her note inside, and took the window seat again, deliberately. And when she glanced at the door at 3:30, he was standing in the entrance of the library in his coat, hat in hand, and he saw her at the window seat, and the almost smile appeared, and then he chose a chair on the opposite side of the room without a word, and opened a different book entirely. They did not speak that afternoon. They did not need to. This became the shape of October. Books moving back and forth between the shelf and their hands, notes folded inside pages, a conversation conducted entirely through margin and paper and the careful calculus of what to say and what to hold back. He was dry and precise, and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny in a way so understated it took her a moment to catch it. She was direct in ways she couldn't be in drawing rooms, honest in ways she had stopped bothering to be in company that would not understand the honesty. She told him, in a note tucked inside Northanger Abbey, "I think I am performing a version of myself that does not entirely exist. The season requires it." He returned the book 3 days later. His answer was on the same page below hers. "I know the performance. I've been doing it since I was 23. The trick is to remember where you put the real version down." She read that note 4 times before she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her dress, where it stayed for a week. The recital was Lady Cavendish's idea of cultural philanthropy, a string quartet, 80 guests and a ballroom rearranged into rows of gilded chairs for a Tuesday evening in the second week of November. Cecily arrived with her mother and was seated in the 4th row, slightly left of centre, which gave her a reasonable view of the musicians and an unreasonable awareness of the door at the back of the room. She was not waiting for him. She told herself this clearly and specifically. She was not waiting for him. She had not wondered whether he would be here, and whatever particular alertness she felt toward the back of the room was simply general social awareness and nothing more. The quartet began. The first movement was something slow and architectural, the music building on itself the way certain mornings build, layer on layer, light following light. She let herself be absorbed by it. Around her, 80 people arranged their faces into expressions of appreciation and occasionally whispered to their neighbors, and the candles in the chandeliers above threw gold across everything, and she thought, "This is the part of London I don't hate. Just this." She heard the door open near the back. She did not turn around. She heard footsteps, quiet, unhurried, with the particular rhythm she had apparently memorized without intending to, and then the soft sound of a chair being moved in the row directly behind her, and then warmth, not contact, nothing that could have been named or reported or considered untoward in any way, simply proximity. He had sat in the chair directly behind and slightly to the left, and the row spacing in Lady Cavendish's ballroom was modest, and she became aware of him behind her the way you become aware of a fire in a room, not by looking at it, but by the direction of warmth and the way the air changes. She kept her eyes on the musicians. He did not speak. Of course he didn't. They were in a room of 80 people, and the quartet was playing, and there was no version of the world in which James Ashbourne made social noise where none was called for. But at one point, in the pause between the second and third movements, when the room breathed and shifted and people murmured to their neighbors, she heard him lean forward, the faint creak of the chair, and then his voice, very low, so close to her ear that no one 2 feet away could have heard it. "The second violin is slightly sharp." She pressed her lips together very hard. "Third measure," he added quietly. "Every time." "I noticed," she murmured, without turning. "I was being polite." A pause, then, "You've been polite for 4 months, is it not exhausting?" This time she could not stop it. A small, helpless breath of laughter escaped her, and she covered it with her hand and turned it into a cough, and the woman beside her glanced over, and she composed her face back to attention. Behind her, barely perceptible, she felt him settle back. The third movement began. She could not have told you a single note of it. She was aware only of the warmth behind her, of the specific angle of his presence slightly to her left, close enough that if she had leaned back by 3 inches, her shoulder would have met something solid. She was aware of her own breathing, which had become a project. She was aware of the scent of him, wool and cold air and that thing she still could not name, and how it was becoming, with a certainty that was almost alarming, the smell her mind associated with feeling held. This is not practical, she told herself. The fourth movement arrived and concluded. The room broke into applause, and around her everyone stood and began the migration toward the refreshments, and she rose with them, gathering herself, her fan, her composure, the neutral expression she was good at, and turned. He was closer than she'd calculated. The standing and turning of the row had compressed the space between them, and she found herself facing him at a distance of perhaps 18 inches, which in the context of a crowd was unremarkable, and in the context of them was not. He had his hat in his hand again. He looked down at her with the steady grey gaze and made no move to step back. Neither did she. The cellist was exceptional, she said, because she needed to say something that was not what she was actually thinking. The cellist was, he agreed. His eyes didn't move from her face. Around them the room flowed and chattered and moved toward the supper table, and they stood in it like 2 fixed points, while everything else circulated past. Then his hand moved, just slightly. His fingers closed around her elbow, barely, the lightest possible contact through the fabric of her sleeve, and she realized a half-second later that she had been about to step back into a chair, that she had been about to fall, that he had seen it before she had and moved without thinking. The chair scraped, she steadied. His hand remained, 1 second. She felt it through the silk of her sleeve, the press of 4 fingers, the solidity of his grip, the warmth of his palm. Her heart had stopped doing anything reasonable, and had decided instead to simply hammer against her ribs, with an urgency that she was fairly certain was visible from outside her body. She looked up at him. Something in his face had shifted. The controlled surface was entirely intact, jaw set, expression neutral, but underneath it, in the specific quality of his gaze, something had gotten loose. Something that looked for 3 unrepeatable seconds, like a man who had made a decision and not yet decided whether to stand by it. His hand dropped. Cecily. Her name. Just that. The way he'd said it in the Pemberton garden. No title, no distance, just the two syllables of her name in his voice, low enough that no one else could hear it. She opened her mouth. "Lady Cecily." Her mother's voice cut across the room from somewhere near the supper table, bright and carrying and completely, catastrophically well-timed. She saw James blink once. The moment, whatever it had been about to become, closed itself quietly and completely the way a book closes. He stepped back. She stepped sideways. "Excuse me," she said, to the air between them. "Of course," he said, to the same air. She walked toward her mother's voice without looking back. Her elbow, where his hand had been, was warm for the rest of the evening. December 11th, 1813, 2:58 p.m. Ravenwood House, Mayfair, the Portrait Gallery. She had not meant to find the gallery. She had meant to find the retiring room, which the Pemberton girls had assured her was on the second floor, third door on the left, but the second floor of Ravenwood House was a different geography entirely from what she had been promised, and the third door on the left had opened not onto powder and mirrors, but onto a long, cold corridor lined on both sides with portraits, stretching away from her into a grey afternoon light that came through a single tall window at the far end. She should have closed the door. She stepped inside instead. The gallery was quiet in the way that only rooms full of painted faces can be quiet. A populated silence, weighted with all the looking that went one way. The portraits ran in sequence along both walls. Men and women in the fashions of different decades, different centuries, their expressions ranging from the magnificent self-importance of an earlier age to something more modern and therefore more ambiguous. She walked slowly, her footsteps hushed on the long carpet runner, reading the small brass plates beneath each frame. Henry Ashbourne, 2nd Duke of Ravenwood, 1703. Charlotte Ashbourne, née Fairfax, 1741. William Ashbourne, 4th Duke, 1779. She stopped near the end of the gallery. The portrait here was newer than the others. The paint still held a certain freshness, the colours not yet muted by decades of air and light. A woman, perhaps 25, painted in a pale dress with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned very slightly toward the light. She was beautiful in an uncomplicated way, with fair hair and an expression that was kind. That was the exact word. Her eyes were kind. Her mouth was just beginning a smile it had not quite committed to yet. The brass plate read, "Eleanor Ashbourne, Duchess of Ravenwood, 1811. Cecily stood very still. She was aware, distantly, that she was doing the thing you were not supposed to do, looking too long at something private, finding the seam in a life that had been sutured closed. She knew she should go. She stayed. She hated sitting for it. She turned. James was standing in the doorway of the gallery, not in evening dress. This was an informal afternoon, and he wore a dark coat, simply cut, no waistcoat, cravat slightly less architectural than usual. He looked like himself in a way that his more formal appearances didn't quite permit. He was looking at the portrait, not at her. She sat for 3 sessions, and then told the painter she found the whole process mortifying and refused a 4th. The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. He finished it from a miniature. Cecily looked back at the portrait. "You can't tell." "No." He moved into the gallery unhurried and stopped beside her at a slight angle, not beside her directly, not crowding, just near. His hands were clasped behind his back. He looked at the painting with an expression she had never seen on him before, unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with her, a private kind of looking that she felt she was witnessing without permission. "She was kind," he said quietly, the same words he had used in the Pemberton garden 4 months ago. But here, in front of the portrait, they carried a different weight. Genuinely kind, not the performed kind that this world rewards, actually, fundamentally kind, the sort of person who remembered things about people, what they were afraid of, what they needed to hear. He paused. "I was in Spain for most of our marriage, and then Portugal. And then I came home and she was already ill, and she—" He stopped. A small, careful stop, like a man who has reached the edge of something and chosen not to step off. "She didn't tell me until I was already home, because she didn't want me to come back for the wrong reasons." Cecily did not breathe. "She said—" His voice dropped very slightly. "I'd rather have you home because you wanted to be, James, than because you felt you had to." A beat. She died 6 weeks later. The gallery held the silence. Outside the tall window at the far end, London was doing its grey December thing. the sky the colour of unpolished pewter, the light flat and diffuse. And then, while Cecily stood there with her heart somewhere in her throat, and no idea whatsoever what the right words were, which was perhaps why she said nothing, which was perhaps the rightest thing she could have done, it began to snow. Not dramatically, not the theatrical snow of stories. Just a quiet beginning, small flakes unhurried, settling against the window glass in silence. She turned toward the light instinctively, the way people do. "It's snowing," she said. He looked up, looked at the window. They moved toward it at the same time. Not by agreement, just by the gravitational fact of snow beginning, which is one of those events that pulls people toward glass regardless of who they are. They stopped side by side at the tall window, and below them Mayfair was going white and quiet, the street softening at the edges, the iron railings taking on a covering, the whole world simplifying itself under the snow's patient revision. She watched a flake hit the glass directly in front of her and flatten into a brief cold star before it melted. "I didn't know you very well," she said carefully. "Before this autumn. I knew your name. I knew what people said about you." "What do they say?" She considered being diplomatic. "That you are formidable, that you don't suffer fools, that since your wife died, you have appeared at the minimum number of social engagements that your title requires and no more." "That's accurate. They also say," she continued, "that you are cold." A pause. Outside, the snow fell steadily now, filling the silence of the street. "Is that what you think?" he asked. She looked at the window rather than at him, because looking at him directly when he asked questions like that was something she had learned to ration carefully. "No," she said. "I think you are someone who learned to put things away. There's a difference." He said nothing for a moment, then, without looking away from the snow, "My father put things away. His father before him. It is rather the family tradition." Another pause. "I thought it was strength for a very long time." "And now?" He turned his head. She turned hers. They were closer than she'd realized. The window ledge was narrow, and they had both drifted toward the light, and now there was perhaps a foot between them. In the grey snowlight his eyes were more green than grey, or perhaps they were always this colour in winter, and she had simply not been close enough before to see it properly. "Now," he said, "I'm less certain." Something moved through her chest. Something that had been building since October, through margin notes and recital warmth and gloved hands on elbows, and that now had arrived at a point where she could not file it under general regard or intellectual interest, or any of the other reasonable categories she had been trying to fit it into. She looked back at the snow. He looked back at the snow, and then, quietly, without ceremony, without looking at her, he said, "Cecily." Just that. Not Lady Cecily. Not Miss Vane. Just Cecily. The way a person says a name they have been saying privately, inside themselves for some time, and have finally permitted out loud. She felt it in her sternum. Her hands, resting on the window ledge, were very still. She was aware of them in the way you are aware of your hands when you are trying not to do anything with them. She was aware of the cold coming through the glass and the warmth of him beside her, and the snow falling on the street below, and the portrait of Eleanor Ashbourne behind them, kind-eyed and patient. "Yes," she said, because she had to say something, and that was what came. He shifted, not away, sideways, almost imperceptibly, so that the space between them reduced by a degree. His hand moved on the window ledge until his little finger rested perhaps 2 inches from hers. Not touching. Close enough that she could feel. Nothing, really. No contact, just proximity, just the knowledge of what was 2 inches away. Her pulse was doing something entirely undignified. "I should tell you something," he said, still quietly, still looking at the window. "All right." A pause that lasted long enough that she became aware of her own heartbeat. "I look for you," he said, "in every room I enter. I look for you first. Before I do anything else, or before I speak to anyone, before I settle anywhere, I look to see if you are there." The snow fell. She couldn't look at him. She was fairly certain that if she looked at him right now, something would happen that neither of them had planned, and she was also fairly certain she would not regret it, and she was also fairly certain she should be more alarmed by that than she was. "And if I'm not?" she asked, very quietly. "Then the room is less interesting," he said. "And I stay less long." She turned then. She couldn't help it. She turned and he was already looking at her, and this was the closest she had ever been to him by choice, without an accident of carriage or crowd to account for it, and his eyes were entirely, devastatingly open. The wall was down. Whatever he had been keeping behind it was simply there, looking at her without apology or calculation, with nothing performed about it. She saw the scar along his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight unsteadiness in his breathing that mirrored her own. He leaned forward, by an inch, maybe two. His eyes dropped, briefly, just briefly, and came back up, and she knew, with the particular knowledge of the body that is faster and more honest than thought, exactly what was about to happen. A door opened. Somewhere behind them, at the far end of the gallery, a door opened and a housemaid entered carrying fresh candles for the wall sconces, humming faintly to herself, entirely unaware. James straightened. He moved back by 3 inches. His hands came together behind his back. His expression reassembled itself with an efficiency that she might have admired if she weren't so busy feeling the absence of where they had almost been. "I should return to my guests," he said. The voice level composed precisely itself. She turned back to the window. "Yes. You'll find the retiring room on the 2nd floor, 4th door, not 3rd. She exhaled a short breath that might, in a different context, have been a laugh. "Thank you." He moved away down the gallery. She listened to his footsteps on the carpet runner, measured, unhurried, entirely controlled, until they reached the door. "James." The footsteps stopped. She kept her face toward the window, toward the snow, toward the city going quietly white below. Her voice, when it came, was steady and honest and something she had not planned to say. "I look for you too," she said. "In every room." A silence. Then the door closed. She stood at the window alone with the snow and her hands on the ledge, and her heart pressing against her ribs like something trying to get out. And she thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me." And she thought a half-second later, with a clarity she couldn't argue with, "I don't care." January 6th, January 19th, 1814. Vane House, Mayfair, and the silence after January arrived the way bad news always arrives, quietly, without announcement, dressed in ordinary clothes. The first week was fine. The first week was still December in its bones, still carrying the warmth of what had happened in the gallery. The snow and the window, and the two things they had said to each other that could not be unsaid. She had returned home from Ravenwood House that afternoon, with her cheeks cold and her chest full of something she was not yet ready to name, and she had sat at her writing desk and not written anything, and then gone to dinner and talked about nothing, and smiled at the correct intervals and gone to bed and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. In the days that followed, a copy of Pride and Prejudice arrived at Vane House with no accompanying card. She found the note on page 112, the passage where Darcy watches Elizabeth across a crowded room. His annotation was a single word, underlined twice, accurate. She pressed the page flat with her palm and felt warmth move from her hand up through her arm and into her chest and spread there. She wrote back, infuriatingly so. She returned the book through the Society's lending system on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he had sent another. The first week of January was fine. The second week was when her father called her into his study. She knew from the way he asked, through the butler formally, Lord Vane requests Lady Cecily's presence at her earliest convenience, that this was not a conversation. It was a proceeding. The study was cold. He had not lit the additional fire, which was either economy or intention, and she stood on the rug in front of his desk in her morning dress and felt the chill of the room settle around her like a verdict. Her father sat behind the desk. He was 51 years old and had once been handsome in a broad, certain way, the kind of man who had always assumed his life would resolve itself in his favor, because it always had. The past 3 years had made adjustments to that assumption that she could see now in the set of his jaw and the particular tightness around his eyes, the expression of a man managing a situation he was furious to be in. He did not ask her to sit. "Mrs. Hollowell saw you," he said, without preamble. "At the Cavendish recital. She saw you with Ravenwood." She kept her face quiet. "I was at the recital, yes. She said you were standing very close together. We were in a crowded room. She said you were alone with him in Lady Cavendish's upstairs corridor. I was leaving the ballroom. He was..." "Cecily." Her father's voice dropped, not to kindness, to the flat, weighted register of a man who is finished with the part of the conversation that involves pretending, I am not interested in the specifics. I am interested in whether you understand what this looks like." She said nothing. He opened the drawer on the left side of his desk. He removed a sheaf of papers, folded annotated reel, and placed them on the surface between them without looking at her. She did not need to read them. She had seen papers like these before, from the accidental open drawer in the autumn. Numbers, creditors, the architecture of a problem that had been building for 3 years and had arrived now at the phase that required a solution. "Lord Merwick," her father said, "has expressed a significant interest." The name landed on her like cold water. Edmund Hartley, the Earl of Merwick. She had met him twice, once at a dinner in November where he had spoken exclusively to the men at the table, and once at a card party where she had watched him berate a footman for a slow pour with a quietness that was worse than shouting. He was 53 years old. He had been married twice before. Neither wife had lived to speak about the experience. She was aware of her hands at her sides and made a deliberate choice not to clench them. "He has made a very generous offer," her father continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man reciting something he has rehearsed. "The settlement would clear the primary debts and establish an annuity sufficient to—" "Father." He stopped. She looked at him. Not at the papers, not at the room, directly at him. And for a moment something moved across his face that might, in another version of this conversation, have been the beginning of something human. It closed. "The engagement will be announced at the Whitmore dinner on the 19th, he said. "That is 2 weeks. I expect you to conduct yourself accordingly in the interim." She stood very still. "Do you understand me?" he asked. Outside the study window, Mayfair went about its January business. A cart on the street. 2 women with packages. The ordinary world proceeding with complete indifference to what was happening in this cold room. "Yes," she said. "I understand you." She left the study with her back straight, and her face composed, and walked up the 2 flights of stairs to her bedroom, and closed the door, and stood with her back against it in the silence of the room, and simply breathed. In, out. She looked at the writing desk, at the small stack of returned books in the corner, at the copy of Emma on the nightstand, still with her ribbon marking page 112. She sat down at the desk. She wrote the note in one draft without revision, because revision would have required her to reconsider, and if she reconsidered she would not send it. She wrote it fast, barely reading it back, and folded it and sealed it before she could change her mind. She wrote no salutation, no signature. "They know. I am to be engaged to the Earl of Merwick. The announcement is January 19th. Do not come to me. Do not write. It will only make it worse for both of us. I am sorry." She gave it to her maid with instructions to deliver it through the Literary Society's private message service. An unmarked envelope, no return address. She sat at the desk after the maid had gone and looked at the closed door for a very long time. The first day of silence was manageable. She told herself, he is being careful. He is thinking. This is what he does. The second day she found herself listening for sounds that weren't there. A knock at the door, a delivery, the particular quality of a message arriving. She went through the motions of the day with perfect external composure. She ate breakfast. She answered letters. She sat with her mother in the drawing room and embroidered something she would never finish. She smiled at the correct intervals. That night she lay in the dark and thought about page 112. About the way he'd said accurate, about snow on a window and 2 inches of cold space between their hands, and the specific, irrevocable sound of her name in his voice. She told herself, he is respecting what you asked. You told him not to write. The third day was harder. She understood, rationally, clearly, that silence was the only reasonable response. That any contact from him now would be dangerous, observed, used as evidence of exactly what her father feared. She understood that a man in his position could not send letters to an engaged woman without consequences, for her reputation that would last far longer than the engagement itself. She understood all of this. It did not help. By the evening of the third day, she had arrived at a conclusion she'd been avoiding since she left the study. It was over. Whatever the gallery had been, whatever October and November had been, the books and the margins and the warmth in a concert hall, it was the kind of thing that existed only in the parenthesis between 2 real things, and the real things had now closed in from both sides and taken up all the space. She went to the Whitmore dinner on the 19th of January in a pale blue dress that her mother had chosen, and her father had approved, and she sat at a long table with 30 guests, and when Lord Merwick took the chair beside her, she kept her hands in her lap and her face composed, and she thought of nothing at all, which was a skill she had been practicing for 3 days and had become quite good at. Her father stood after the fish course and made the announcement with the particular warmth of a man who has resolved a financial crisis through other people's lives and considers this a success. The table applauded. Lord Merwick turned to her and said something she processed only as noise. She smiled. She raised her glass. Across the room, the wife of a parliamentary lord caught her eye with an expression of sympathy so fleeting and so quickly covered that Cecily might have imagined it. She did not imagine it. She went home that night and undressed in silence and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the copy of Emma on the nightstand. She picked it up. Opened to page 112. She looked at the word he had written. Accurate. She closed the book. She put it in the drawer of the nightstand and closed the drawer and turned down the lamp and lay down in the dark. And outside in the January street, London made its cold and indifferent sounds, and she pressed her lips together and made no sound at all. 3 days later, a book arrived at Vane House. No card, no society wrapping, just a slim volume, delivered by a boy she didn't recognize to the side entrance, left with the kitchen maid without explanation. The collected letters of Lord Byron. The same copy from the Literary Society. She recognized the cover, a small wear mark on the lower right corner she had noticed months ago. Her hands were not entirely steady as she opened it. He had not left a note on a folded paper this time. He had written in the margin of the very last page, the final page of the final letter, at the bottom, in his precise and unhurried hand, "I read your note 3 times. I understand what you are asking. I intend to respect it." She exhaled. Then she turned the page. There was no next page in the text, but on the blank end paper at the back cover, he had written 2 more lines. "But I want you to know one thing before I do, not for any practical reason, simply because it is true and I have discovered somewhat inconveniently that I cannot leave it unsaid." And below that, a single line. No elaboration, no qualification. Just, "You are the first thing in 4 years that has made me want to stay somewhere." She sat on the edge of her bed with the Byron in her hands and the January light coming grey through the window and Lord Merwick's ring, sent that morning in a velvet box she had not yet opened, sitting on her dressing table, and she read the line again and again. And then she closed the book carefully and held it in her lap and looked at the closed drawer where Emma was, and at the velvet box on the dressing table, and at the grey January window, and she thought, "I cannot do this." Not the thought of someone surprised, the thought of someone who has known something for a while and has finally stopped pretending they didn't. "I cannot do this." She sat with it for a long time. Then she got up, went to the writing desk, opened it. She did not write to him. Not yet. Instead, she took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote a single question to herself in her own handwriting, as clearly as she could form it. "What are you willing to lose?" She looked at the question for a long time. Then she wrote the answer below it. She folded the paper, put it in the back of the Byron behind his note on the end paper. She did not sleep. She planned. February 13th, February 14th, 1814. Vane House, Mayfair, 11:47 p.m. to 2:03 a.m. She had been planning for 3 weeks, not frantically, not with the desperate visible energy of someone coming apart. That would have been noticed, and being noticed was the one thing she could not afford. She had planned the way she had learned to do everything that mattered, quietly, methodically in the spaces between the things that other people were watching. She had moved money, a small amount, her own, from the quarterly allowance she had been setting aside since she was 16 with no particular purpose in mind, as though some part of her had always known there might be a morning when she needed it. She had spoken to no one. She had asked no questions that could be traced. She had sat at dinners with Lord Merwick and smiled and answered and given every outward appearance of a woman settling into her future, and inside she had been entirely elsewhere. The book had gone back to James through the Society's service 2 days after she'd received it. She had written nothing new. She had simply marked a page, page 41 of the Byron, a letter in which the poet describes leaving England for the last time, standing at the rail of the ship, watching the coast disappear. She had underlined one sentence: "I have made my choice, and I find, to my surprise, that I am not afraid." Below it, in her handwriting, February 14th, 2 a.m., Sidegate. And below that, in letters she had pressed harder than necessary into the paper, as though the pressure itself was a form of meaning. Only if you want to. Not otherwise. I mean this. That had been 4 days ago. He had not responded. She had not expected him to. A response would have required a channel, and every channel was now observed. She had sent the message, and then she had simply continued to exist in the house and the days and the ordinary machinery of her life, and she had not let herself consider the possibility that she would walk out of the side gate at 2 in the morning and find an empty street. She had not let herself consider it. She had also not slept more than 4 hours in any of the 4 nights since. The evening of the 13th was a dinner. Her father's guests, 3 men whose names she had processed and immediately released, a parliamentary matter, something to do with land in the north, filled the dining room with the particular sound of men who consider their own voices the most interesting sound in any room. Lord Merwick was present. He sat at her father's right hand and spoke across the table to her twice. Both times about the house in Wiltshire she was expected to consider her future home, and she said the appropriate things and lifted her glass at the appropriate moments and watched the candles burn down through the courses. Merwick's hand covered hers at one point, briefly, heavy, proprietary, while making a point to her father about the spring calendar. She did not pull away. She looked at the candle directly in front of her and breathed carefully through her nose and waited for him to finish the sentence and lift his hand. When the ladies withdrew, she sat in the drawing room with her mother and 2 other women and answered questions about wedding preparations with a composure she had refined over 22 days of practice. And when the clock on the mantel struck 10, she excused herself with a headache. So sorry, the evening has been such a warm one, and went upstairs. She did not go to bed. She sat at the writing desk in her room with the lamp turned low and her bag, packed 3 days ago, hidden under the loose board beneath the window seat, on the floor beside her feet. She listened to the house, the dinner guests leaving in stages, carriages in the street, her father's voice in the hall, doors, the gradual settling of the building into its night sounds, the clock in the downstairs hall marking 11. 11:30, 11:45. She changed out of her dinner dress alone. She had dismissed her maid early with the headache as explanation, and into her travelling clothes, dark wool, plain, her warmest cloak. She braided her own hair, not well, but pinned well enough to stay under a hood. She put on her gloves. She picked up the bag. She stood in the centre of her room. She looked at the writing desk, the nightstand, the copy of Emma still in the drawer. The velvet box on the dressing table, still unopened. She had never opened it. She looked at the embroidery frame in the corner with the unfinished work she would never finish. She looked at the window, where the London winter pressed its grey face against the glass. She thought about her mother, asleep down the hall, who was not a cruel woman, simply a managed one. She thought about what would be said tomorrow when they found her room empty. She thought about the weight of the name she was about to leave behind, and the weight of the name she was about to take instead, and she stood in the balance of those 2 weights for a long moment. Then she picked up the bag. She opened the door. The side gate of Vane House opened onto a narrow service lane that ran between the garden wall and the mews of the house behind. At this hour it was dark and very quiet, lit by a single gas lamp at the lane's far end that threw more shadow than light. She pressed through the gate, pulled it closed behind her, carefully, the latch settling with a sound that was barely a sound at all. She looked left, she looked right. The lane was empty. She stood very still. The cold was immediate, February at 2 in the morning, with a wind coming from the north that found every gap in her cloak and made itself at home. The cobblestones beneath her boots were slick with the earlier rain. Above the roofline the sky was a deep, pressing grey, the kind that carries more weather. She looked at the empty lane. She counted to 30. Told herself it was simply timing, that a carriage without markings could not idle in a service lane without drawing attention, and he would have timed the arrival precisely. She counted to 60. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. He is not coming. The thought arrived quietly, without drama, and with it the full understanding of what she was standing in, a service lane at 2 in the morning with a bag in her hand and a gate she had just closed behind her and a house full of people she could not go back to. Not now. Not as she had been. She had folded that possibility closed the moment the latch clicked. She had known, when she sent the note, that there was a version of this where she stood in this lane alone. She had chosen to come anyway. She lifted her chin. looked at the gas lamp at the end of the lane. She would walk to the main road. She would find a coaching inn. She had money. She had a plan that extended as far as a coaching inn, and she would build the rest from there. She would... The sound of wheels, very slow, very deliberate. A single horse and a small closed carriage without lanterns, moving into the lane from the far end, with the particular carefulness of a vehicle trying not to be heard. It stopped 20 feet from where she stood. The door opened. He stepped down. No livery. Dark coat, dark hat, a scarf she had not seen before. A man dressed not as a duke, but as someone who understood that tonight the title was a liability and had dressed accordingly. He moved toward her with the same unhurried certainty he brought to every room, every space, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her in the dim light of the distant lamp and took in one quiet, comprehensive look, the bag in her hand, the set of her jaw, the fact that she had been standing here alone. "How long have you been waiting?" he said. 2 minutes. He looked at her steadily. "You're lying." 4. A pause. Perhaps 6. Something moved through his expression. Something swift and unguarded, gone before she could name it, but not before she had seen it. He looked at her face the way he had looked at her across the gallery window in December, with nothing between what he felt and the looking of it. "Cecily," he said, the same way he always said it, like something true. "You came," she said. "Yes. I told you only if you wanted to. I know what you told me." His voice was very quiet. "I came." She looked at him in the cold lane with the gas lamp behind him, and her bag in her hand, and 3 weeks of planning, and 22 days of composure, and 4 nights of 4 hours of sleep, and something in her chest, something that had been held very tightly together for a very long time, moved. She did not cry. She was not in the end a woman who cried in service lanes. But her breath came unsteadily for a moment, one involuntary catch, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the cobblestones and re-established herself. He waited. He was very good at waiting. When she looked up, he was still there, still steady, still just looking at her. He extended his hand. Not an arm for escorting, not the formal offer of a man performing a courtesy, just his hand, open in the space between them, an offering without conditions. A question that would accept either answer. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She thought about the Byron on the end paper, the first thing in 4 years that has made me want to stay somewhere. She thought about the snow on the window and the margin note that said accurate, and the 40 minutes in the Pemberton garden when he had simply stayed. She thought about the recital at her elbow, and 6 months of learning the shape of a person in increments, in margins and silences, and the specific warmth of proximity. She thought about the empty drawing room she had just left, the velvet box, still sealed, the weight of a future she had been given without consultation. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm through his glove, certain, unhurried. He didn't pull her forward. He simply held her hand and looked at her for one more moment, as though confirming something privately, as though putting it away carefully somewhere it would not be lost. Then he turned and walked her to the carriage. He opened the door. She climbed in. He followed. The door closed. The driver, wordless, efficient, clearly chosen for exactly these qualities, set the horse moving immediately, and the carriage pulled out of the service lane and into the main road. And within 3 minutes, Vane House was behind them, and London was opening up around them, dark and wet and indifferent, and ahead of them the North Road stretched into the dark toward the border. She settled against the seat. He settled across from her. The city began to thin. The buildings gave way to the wider roads, the wider sky, and then the rain came, first as a sound on the roof and then as a full assault, hammering the frame, running in rivers down the windows, turning the world outside into a moving blur of black and grey. She watched it. He watched it. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers or the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the most important things already, in margins and service lanes and December galleries, and are now simply here, together, moving. She felt his eyes on her after a while, not immediately. He gave her time with the window, with the rain, with the transition from everything that was to everything that would be. But eventually, quietly, she felt the particular quality of being seen that she had come to know as specifically his. She turned. He was looking at her the way she had known he would, directly, fully, with the wall entirely down. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. The rain, the dark, the North Road, 3 hours and a Scottish border and everything that came after. "Yes," she said. He nodded once as though this was the right answer. "So am I," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the admission, at the fact of it, at the specific courage it took for this particular man to say that particular thing. And for the first time since she had walked out of the side gate into the cold lane, something in her chest unclenched. Not all the way, but enough. She turned back to the window. The rain fell. The carriage moved north. The miles of England unrolled themselves in the dark, and somewhere ahead, across a border that still felt abstract and impossible, a different life was waiting to begin. She did not know in that moment how it would go. She did not know what the morning would bring, or what her father would do, or what the world would say. She knew only the sound of the rain and the movement of the road, and the warmth of a man sitting 3 feet from her, who had come at 2 in the morning to a dark lane, because she had asked him to, and because he had wanted to, and because some things, in the end, are simply that. She closed her eyes. Outside, England passed. February 14th, 1814, 5:49 a.m. Gretna Green, Scotland, the Anvil House. The rain stopped at 5 in the morning. Not gradually, not the slow tapering she might have expected, the storm losing conviction over miles of northern road. It stopped all at once, as though someone had simply decided, and the silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that it woke her. She had not meant to sleep. She became aware of herself in stages, the seat beneath her, the cloak pulled up around her shoulders, the grey light beginning at the edges of the carriage windows, the stillness of the wheels. They had stopped. She sat up. James was awake. He was looking at the window, and in the new grey light of early morning she could see his face clearly for the first time in hours. The strong line of his profile, the shadow along his jaw where he hadn't shaved, the particular stillness of a man who has been awake and thinking, and has arrived at some point in the dark hours at a place of quiet. He turned when she moved. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the small space of the carriage, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't entirely let herself understand before, that he was afraid too. Not visibly, not in any way that most people would have been able to see. But she had spent 6 months learning the grammar of him, and she could read it, in the set of his shoulders, slightly less perfect than usual, and in the way his hands rested open on his knees, rather than folded or controlled. Open, she thought. He is open. "We're here," he said. She looked at the window. Through the glass, in the pale beginning of a February morning, she could see a village coming into its first light. Low stone buildings, a narrow street. The hills beyond, still dark against a sky that was moving from black to a deep, uncertain grey. Everything was wet from the rain, the cobblestones, the rooftops, the iron sign swinging gently outside the nearest building, and the world had that particular washed quality of somewhere that has been thoroughly rained on, and is now cautiously considering something new. She could see the Anvil House from the window. She had known in the abstract what it would look like. She had heard it described in whispers at enough dinner parties to have assembled a rough picture. But the reality of it was smaller and plainer than imagination. A low stone building, perhaps 40 feet wide, with a heavy wooden door and a single window to the left of it. A light inside visible even now, which meant the blacksmith was already awake or had never slept, or was the kind of man who understood that people arrived at all hours with urgent needs. She looked at it for a long time. James looked at her, looking at it. The driver's footsteps crossed the gravel outside. The door opened. Cold air came in. Scottish cold, which was a different proposition entirely from London cold, carrying in it the hills and the particular clean sharpness of a country that did not apologize for its weather. She stepped out. The ground was solid under her boots. The village was quiet, a dog somewhere, the creak of the iron sign, the distant sound of a stream she couldn't see. Her breath made clouds. She stood beside the carriage and looked at the Anvil House, and felt the full weight of where she was and what she was about to do settle around her, not like a burden, but like a coat. Something real and substantial that she was putting on. James came to stand beside her, not close, respectful distance, shoulder to shoulder, more or less, both of them facing the same plain stone building in the first grey light of Valentine's morning. She was aware of him, with every cell of her body. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. "Most things are." She almost smiled, she almost didn't. The threshold of the moment held her somewhere between the two. She looked at the door, the light in the window, the iron sign. She could read it now in the growing light. D. McKinnon Smith. Plain and direct and entirely uninterested in the weight of what it represented to the people who came to it. She thought about her father waking in 3 hours to an empty room. She thought about the announcement in the papers, the whispers in drawing rooms, the particular satisfaction with which certain women would repeat her name with that specific inflection. Lady Cecily Vane, who ran, as though running were the worst thing a person could do, as though staying were always the same as being safe. She thought about Merwick's hand on hers at the dinner table. She thought about a drawer left open, and columns of numbers and the cold study and her father's voice saying the engagement will be announced on the 19th, with the flat finality of a man disposing of inventory. She felt James turn toward her slightly. "Cecily." She turned. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the portrait gallery, fully without the wall. And in the dim morning light the scar along his jaw was a silver line against his skin, and his eyes were darker than grey. Or perhaps they were every colour at once, and she thought, "I have memorised this face, without deciding to, without trying. I simply looked, and looked, and looked again, and now it is part of the furniture of my mind." He took a breath. "There is something I need to say to you before we go in there." She waited. He looked at the Anvil House for a moment, a brief, almost involuntary glance, as though reminding himself of where they were, and then back at her, and whatever he found in her face when he looked appeared to steady him in some way, the way true north steadies a compass. "You know what I am," he said. "You know what you're walking into. Not just the scandal. I mean me. The silences. The putting things away. The fact that I spent 3 years at war and came home to a wife I hadn't known how to love properly while she was alive." His voice was level, but underneath it she could hear the thing that was not level. "I am not an easy man, Cecily. I have never been an easy man. And I am standing here asking you to walk through that door, and I want you to know that I understand what I am asking." She held his gaze. "What are you asking?" she said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose me." The words simple, the weight behind them enormous. Not the title, not the solution, not the escape from what's behind you. Me. This. A slight movement of his hand, not quite pointing at himself, more an indication of the whole complicated fact of him. "Because if you walk through that door for any other reason, I would rather drive you to wherever you want to go and set you up somewhere you can live freely and never—" "James." He stopped. She took one step toward him, then another. The gravel crunched under her boots in the village quiet, and she closed the distance between them until she was close enough to see the exact line where grey met green in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth he put out in the cold morning air. She looked up at him. "Do you remember what I wrote to you? In the service lane note?" His jaw shifted. "Yes." "What did I write?" A pause. His voice very low. "Only if you want to, not otherwise." "I wrote that to you," she said, "because I needed you to come freely, not out of obligation, not out of the logic of the situation." She held his gaze. "I am asking the same thing of you. Give me the same thing back." He looked at her. The village breathed around them. That one dog, that distant stream, the first uncertain bird somewhere in the dark hills deciding that morning had arrived. The iron sign creaked once and was still. Inside the Anvil House, the light shifted as someone moved past the window. "I looked for you in every room," she said. "For 6 months I looked for you first, before anything else, before I let myself settle anywhere." Her voice was steady. She was glad it was steady. "I am not walking through that door because of Merwick or my father, or the debts or any of the reasons that make this make sense on paper." She paused. "I am walking through that door because it is 5 in the morning, and we are in Scotland, and I have been in a carriage with you for 3 hours, and you slept. You slept for 40 minutes around Leicester, and you listed slightly to the left when you did, and I know that because I watched you, and I could not possibly be more certain of anything than I am certain of this." Something happened to his face, not a collapse. He was not a man who collapsed. But something like the final letting go of a thing that has been held for a very long time. His expression moved through something private and complicated, and arrived somewhere new, somewhere quieter and more open and less defended than she had ever seen it. He lifted his hand, slowly, unhurriedly, with the deliberateness of a man making a conscious choice at every stage of the movement. His fingers touched her cheek, the lightest possible contact, the curve of his hand barely holding her face, his thumb at the line of her cheekbone, not pulling her, not directing, just touching her, for the first time, of his own choosing, without accident or crowd to excuse it. She felt it everywhere. She felt it from the point of contact outward, through her jaw and her throat, and down through her chest to somewhere behind her ribs. And she understood in that moment why she had been counting his silences and memorizing his face, and pressing his notes into the back of drawers, because she had known in the way the body knows things before the mind admits them, that this was where they were going. That all of it, the Byron and the garden and the snow and the 3 days of silence and the empty lane at 2 in the morning, had been the long road to this specific moment. His forehead came down to hers. Just that. Contact. Stillness. Their breath mingled in the cold air. She closed her eyes. Cecily. Her name in his voice. In the quiet. With nothing behind it but the fact of it. Yes, she said. He straightened, held out his hand. She took it, and she noticed as she did that his fingers were not entirely steady around hers, and she loved him for that, fiercely and quietly and completely, loved him for the unsteadiness that proved the steadiness was chosen and not simply easy. They walked to the door together. He pushed it open. The smithy was warm and smelled of coal and iron and the particular ancient earthiness of a room that has been in continuous use for longer than anyone alive can remember. The fire was already lit, burning low and steady in the forge, throwing red-orange light across stone walls and the heavy, dark surface of the anvil in the center of the room. David McKinnon was perhaps 60, with the broad build and unhurried manner of a man who had witnessed enough of human urgency to have stopped being surprised by it. He looked at them from the bench where he sat with his tea, took in the London clothes and the small bag, and the hour and the particular expression of two people who have made an irreversible decision and are at peace with it, and he set down his cup. "English," he said. Not a question. "Yes," James said. "Come far?" "Far enough." McKinnon looked at her. "You're here of your own will, lass." "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He nodded once, a slow, considering nod, and stood. "Right then," he said. "Let's get on with it." It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes in a warm stone room with a fire and an anvil, and the words that turned two separate people into a thing the law recognized as one. 11 minutes that were nothing like the ceremony she had been raised to expect. No flowers, no assembled witnesses in silk and powder, no organ and vaulted ceiling, and the heavy processional of social performance. Just the fire, the anvil, an old man's voice, and James beside her, holding her hand with the particular quality of a man who has decided something and is finished deciding. When McKinnon said the words that required her answer, she said "I will" with a voice that did not waver. When he said them to James, there was a pause, brief, perhaps half a second, the pause of a man who has not said these words before, who has and will always understand their weight. And then, "I will." Quiet, certain, final. When it was done, McKinnon signed the register and handed the pen to James, who signed with his full name and title in that precise, unhurried hand, and then to her, and she signed Cecily Ashbourne for the first time, and the ink dried in the warmth of the room, and that was that. She looked at the signature for a moment. Cecily Ashbourne. A new name, new weight, new world. James was looking at the same thing from beside her. She turned to him. He turned to her. There was so much she could have said. So many words available to the moment, everything that had been building since August, and the third pillar from the left, and the man who had said "You look as thoroughly bored as I feel" to a girl he didn't know, at a ball he didn't want to be at. She said none of it. She simply looked at him, at the scar in the tired eyes and the open, undefended face of a man who had decided, somewhere on a winter road at 4 in the morning, to stop carrying things alone. He looked back at her, at whatever she was, whatever he saw, whatever had been enough to bring him to a dark lane at 2 in the morning with a plain carriage and no livery. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. Not fully. Not like this. He smiled. Not the almost smile. Not the corner of the mouth restraint. A real smile, slow and warm and slightly uneven, creasing the corners of his eyes, and changing the whole geography of his face into something she had not known it could be. She felt it land in her chest like the first day of spring. "Good morning, Duchess," he said softly. She laughed, genuine, startled, the kind of laugh that belongs only to moments of relief, so complete the body doesn't know what else to do with it. "Good morning," she said. Outside, Scotland had made up its mind about the day. The sky had moved from grey to a pale, uncertain gold, the sun not yet visible, but its evidence everywhere. In the brightness at the edge of the hills, in the way the wet village rooftops had begun to gleam, in the quality of the light on the cobblestones that suggested warmth was coming, was already decided, was on its way. She stood in the doorway of the Anvil house with James beside her and looked at it, the hills and the light and the washed quiet village and the long road that stretched back south toward everything they had left and forward toward everything they had not yet become. His hands came to her shoulders from behind. He didn't pull her back. He simply stood there, behind her, around her in the loosest possible sense, his presence steady and warm at her back, and looked at the same morning she was looking at. She leaned back, just slightly, just enough. He held still. The sun broke the edge of the far hill. It came in a line, sharp and immediate and absolutely certain, and it crossed the village in seconds, and it reached them where they stood in the doorway, and it was cold, February cold, but the light was on her face, and his hands were on her shoulders, and behind them the register lay open with 2 signatures drying on the page. She closed her eyes. She thought, "My father will wake in 2 hours." She thought, "The papers will say something by Thursday." She thought, "Merwick will be furious. The Whitmore table will talk about nothing else. Mrs. Hollowell will consider herself vindicated." She thought all of these things the way you think of weather that has already passed, aware of it, not afraid of it, finished with the fearing of it. She opened her eyes. The light was still there. "What happens now?" she asked. His hands shifted slightly on her shoulders. Not adjusting, settling. The difference was small and mattered entirely. "Now," he said, "we go home. Home." She turned the word over privately, feeling its new weight, its new meaning. The word stripped of Vane House and her father's study, and the cold room and the velvet box, and everything it had meant for 19 years, and filled instead with something she did not have a complete picture of yet, something that was still being built, something that would look like a man who listed left when he slept, and read Byron in Gardens, and said her name like it was something he had decided to keep. "All right," she said. The sun climbed, the village woke, and somewhere to the south London was still sleeping, not yet aware of what the morning had done. This is a work of historical fiction. While inspired by real historical settings and traditions, all characters, events, and situations are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.
Rain on the windows, midnight and breath.